Welcome back to Strange New Worlds, a science and Star Trek podcast. I'm your host, Mike Wong. If you've been paying attention, you know that last year was a pretty depressing year for science as a whole. But for me personally, it felt like the science gods spared me. Last summer, I learned that my team had won a huge NASA astrobiology proposal to develop new tools and strategies for looking for life beyond Earth by combining multiple lines of evidence or different data streams with machine learning. Now isn't the time to get into all the gory details, but essentially, we're going to seek out new ways to seek out new life in the universe. Winning that grant was easily one of the biggest moments in my young career so far, right up there with getting into college, publishing my first paper, and defending my PhD. And I co-led that proposal with today's guest on the show, Dr. Caleb Scharf, the senior scientist for astrobiology at NASA Ames. I am so proud to be his co-captain on the project because Caleb's scientific work and writings have had a huge impact on my career. As a fellow astrobiologist, I am interested in seeking out new life in the universe, but in my previous appointment, I was becoming disillusioned with the state-of-the-art of biosignature research. And then I read Caleb's 2021 book, The Ascent of Information, which talks about how information can take on a life of its own. That book changed the way I looked at the world, inspiring me down a new path in science, one that utilizes data science, informatics, and machine learning to supercharge our search for life beyond Earth. Now, Caleb has a new book out called The Giant Leap: Why Space is the Next Frontier in the Evolution of Life. And this one is just as mind-blowing. By looking back at the history of human exploration, it helps us understand how we, as a species, have gotten ourselves to the brink of traveling amongst the stars. And it provides detailed thoughts about what that transition might look like. You don't need to have read The Giant Leap to enjoy today's conversation, but I highly recommend picking up a copy of the book from your local bookseller because it's one inspiring ride. And now, without further ado, here's Caleb Scharf. Caleb Scharf, welcome back to Strange New Worlds, a science and Star Trek podcast.
Well, thanks for inviting me back.
I'm so excited to talk to you about your new book, The Giant Leap: Why Space is the Next Frontier in the Evolution of Life. Wonderful book. Just had the chance to finish reading it over the past few weeks. And my first question for you, Caleb, is about the origin of this book. You know, the last time we spoke in the show, you were the director of the astrobiology program at Columbia University. Now you're the senior scientist for astrobiology at NASA Ames. Was that career move at all related to you writing a book about humanity's journey into outer space?
It wasn't really, to be perfectly honest. I had started the preparations for the book quite a long time before I had an opportunity to move to NASA. But I guess I'd be lying if I didn't say that my enthusiasm for thinking about and exploring the ideas of space exploration was such that, when NASA comes calling, you say yes.
Indeed. Tell me about the origins of the book then. If it had nothing to do with your move to NASA, how did you decide, okay, now's the time to write a new book about space exploration?
Well, I like writing books, as you know. So it had a long gestation. It came in part from, having developed over many years at Columbia University, where I was, a mathematically driven course for upper level undergrads on the science of space exploration. And doing that course was a lot of fun. And it also got me to realize just the sheer quantity of exploration and work and innovation and discovery that has taken place over the last 60, 70 years is something that even I had not fully appreciated. So part of the motivation for the book was this nerdy desire to write it all down, to have fun with it, to just talk about all the crazy, wild stuff that we've done. But that also grew into a deeper question for me as an astrobiologist, thinking about the nature of life in the universe. And I found myself asking, what does this do to a species?
Hmm.
What does moving beyond its planetary point of origin do to a species, or what might it do to a species? And obviously, that's intimately connected with how that happens, about the history of space exploration, about the nature of the technology, and about the future directions. So it all kind of stemmed from that. And then it was a question of persuading my agent and my publisher that this was a good idea.
So, if there was a moment in the history of space exploration that really influenced my life, it was the day in 1996 when the news of ALH 84001 broke out. Star Trek had always been this constant hum in the background, guiding me toward a career in space. But I distinctly remember this day when my mom brought me the newspaper and showed me the article where NASA's discovered life in a Martian meteorite. And I just thought, wow, that's so cool. I want to be able to make a discovery like that one day. Of course, since then, this has been a hotly debated scientific subject, and now the consensus is there's actually no evidence for life in that particular meteorite. But still, I think it was a catalyzing moment for me personally, but also for the field of astrobiology. Caleb, what has been the most memorable space milestone for you in your lifetime?
It's a great question. I'm a bit older than you, so so some of my memorable moments of space exploration go back a bit further. One moment I do recall, much like you, I was handed something by a parent. And this was in 1976, or maybe it was 1977. I think, the information sort of trickled out. And it was a copy of National Geographic magazine. And the front cover of that copy of National Geographic magazine was a picture of Mars from the surface of Mars. And it was a picture from one of the Viking landers on Mars. So the Viking landers touched down on Mars in 1976. And to me, that was a moment where suddenly, there were these color images from the surface of another world, from this planet I'd heard of. I mean, much like you, I sort of was aware of Star Trek and things like that, and the ideas and possibilities. But to have these glossy color images from the surface of another planet where you can just see bits of the lander poking out on the side of the image, the NASA emblem, the United States flag, and so on. That really made an impression on me. It felt like you could touch the alien for a moment as a kid, right? It,
Yeah.
it was just this kind of, yeah, inspiring moment where it's like, wow, there's more than what we see here around us. There's more out there in the universe. And look, color pictures. How cool is that?
So, a through line for your book is Charles Darwin's voyage on the Beagle, that historic voyage that gave the young naturalist the experiences that would eventually bring him his famous theory of evolution. Now, I've got a confession to make to you, Caleb. I've never actually read any of Charles Darwin's original writings from the 1800s. I guess I've just been too busy reading more recent science. So, my question is, did you have to do a lot of historical research for this book, or were you already very well versed in Darwin's story?
I'd love to be able to say I was incredibly well versed in Darwin's story. I mean, I had some exposure to it. I have to say, Darwin was a good writer, and I really recommend going and looking at both the origin of the species and particularly his diaries from his voyage on the Beagle in the 1830s, because they're wonderful. They're a product of the time, sort of, slightly stilted language compared to modern language, but his powers of observation are very apparent, and his ability to succinctly convey not only scientific ideas, but the emotional side of things, the sense of wonder. The voyage of the Beagle, 5 years going around, essentially around the planet. Yeah, so I had been somewhat exposed to that before because out of curiosity, I had read his writings. But sure, for a book, you need to go a bit deeper. And so I found myself going back to that material. What's wonderful these days is it's all online. There's a beautiful Darwin archive, digital archive, that has not only his published versions of things like his diary, but his more detailed notes. Not everything was published for the public at the time, but he had these extraordinary notes and detailed, writings in the marginalia of his diary and so on. So, it wasn't that much work to look at his stuff because it was so much fun. It was so interesting. And there are stories in there that I had not been aware of. His encountering fossils in South America and deducing that fossils have been washed down a river and then tracking that river back to where the origin of these, fossilized teeth and so on were in a more complete skeleton and so on. It just really extraordinary story. So I recommend it, Mike. Your education is not fully complete unless you've read some of this.
Okay, I'll go do my homework. So, one of the things that really blew my mind in the book was how you showed how Darwin's theory of evolution, again, which he came up with and published in the 1800s, planted the seeds for today's boom in artificial intelligence. Caleb, could you connect that causal thread for our audience?
Absolutely. And just to say before I get into that, the reason why I talk a lot about Darwin and his voyage on the Beagle in this book about space exploration is because of the parallels. There are parallels in the mechanics of exploration, but there are also parallels in, I think, and this gets to the point about AI, in what his thoughts and his discoveries, if you want to call them that spilled out of that voyage and his later work in the theory of evolution, what those have done to us as a species. Ideas change things, and his theory of evolution caused more evolution. It caused evolution in our thinking, evolution in our actions, and therefore evolution in essentially the whole biosphere on Earth, I would claim. So the AI point is really intriguing. Much modern AI is based around the idea of algorithms that discover themselves, that program themselves, that evolve, that undergo selection. The successful pieces, are selected away and so on. And I think the argument I make in the book is that when Darwin wrote about his theory of evolution, the idea of variation among species acted upon by selective pressures that then prune those variations down to the more successful ones. That was a picture of this idea of feedback that was far more complex than anything anyone had really thought about before. Engineers knew about feedback. Steam engines used feedback to regulate themselves and so on. But the idea of feedback as inducing change in the world, I think was relatively new at the time, and it really embedded itself in the way that we all think about the world. We think about change, we think about how things optimize themselves. The most obvious thread from Darwin's work to modern computer science and AI is in things like algorithms called genetic algorithms, where essentially you try to find a solution to a problem in many different ways, and you then test each of those approaches, and the approaches that are less good at getting to a solution, you do away with, and the remaining solutions, you modify them all a little bit. You give them a little random tweak, much like variation in natural selection. Then you see which from that population do a better job at solving the problem. And while that is sort of one piece of modern machine learning, it's not necessarily directly the same as modern AI and large language models, but it's that idea of feedback induced change, sort of systematic, iterative change. And it may take a while. It may take millions or billions of compute cycles to sort of perfect your algorithm, which is essentially what most modern AI is doing. So I would argue that yes, there's a real heritage back to Darwin's ideas that percolated into the way we all think about things. They percolated into science. They eventually percolated into mathematics and computer science once that became a thing, and therefore into the design of algorithms. So it's, yeah, you know, historians might argue with me about this, but to me, it feels like a very clear intellectual lineage between Darwin's sort of ideas about how the world shapes itself to our ideas about algorithms that shape themselves based on data.
I mean, that all makes so much sense to me. I think when it boils down to the heart of things, science really is just about the study of change, how change happens in our world. And Darwin showed us how change happens in the biological world. And with that knowledge, then we can go on and induce new types of change in our societies and in our technological world as well.
Exactly, exactly.
Now, the core theme of your book, The Giant Leap, is this idea of dispersal. Caleb, could you summarize dispersal in a sentence or two?
So this is dispersal with a capital D. So dispersal happens to life and has happened to life since ever on the Earth. It's the idea that organisms will extend themselves, disperse out into new environments, and then undergo change because of that exposure to new environments. The concept of dispersal with a capital D that I have in the book is taking that idea from the Earth and extending it out into the universe. And dispersal, I would claim, is a set of outcomes and a set of properties for living systems that extend beyond their point of origin, that disperse out into the universe. And it's fundamentally different because of the fundamental differences in the landscape that that species is dispersing into in terms of scale, in terms of time, in terms of resources. So that's a bit more than two sentences, but that's pretty much it.
That's great. And in the book, you write that the idea of dispersal is a hopeful notion for you. Why is that so?
Well, it comes to those properties of a dispersing species or dispersing life, which are to do with change and evolution. And to me, the idea of dispersal into interplanetary space, dispersal of a species or multiple species or all of life from a point of origin out into a very different landscape, the vast landscape of our solar system, which is vast in terms of scale and in terms of resources, must inevitably bring change. It allows for diversification. We know this happens on the Earth, that species that spread into some new environment, one species will become many species. They will speciate. It's a known characteristic as life is exposed to different selective pressures. And for me, that is a really hopeful idea. Certainly, as a contemporary human, surveying the current situation that we face on the earth, it can feel that we're sort of hemmed in, we're closed in, and it's the same old battles again and again, the same old arguments, the same struggles with resources, the same struggles with differences of opinion, differences of culture, and so on. And I ask myself, how do you break out of that cycle when you're on a finite planet? I think the idealists among us will say, well, we can understand intellectually how to construct a perfect society. We can understand how to create a more equitable world. Implementing that, as we've seen over thousands of years of human history, is extraordinarily difficult. And I think it's even more difficult when you are in a known environment and a contained environment. So the hope for me, and this is very big picture, Star Trek,
Yeah.
big picture, is that species or life in the universe that manages to go beyond its point of origin in a serious way, really to disperse, has the opportunity to change the underlying rules of their existence in a way that I think is perhaps not possible if you're restricted to your point of origin. And for me, that's endlessly hopeful. It means that the universe is offering up some other options for us. And I believe that we're beginning to tap into those other options, and the potential is there to do more and to essentially see where it takes us. But it might solve some of our problems.
Last month, you gave a book talk here in DC. There was this wonderful quote. You said, space exploration is not about ignoring Earth's problems. It's about creating chances for us to do better. And I feel like that really encapsulates this nugget of hope in dispersal. Nonetheless, I feel like a lot of the audience questions during that talk sort of tried to push back against this optimism. People felt that by going to space, we weren't actually going to create new solutions, but just perpetuate the problems that we see here on Earth. Caleb, have you found that kind of response to be a common response to your book, or was that just particular to our audience in DC?
I think the DC audience may be particularly cynical about the possibilities for human improvement. Yeah, it is a response, and I understand that response. I've heard it from many other people and people who've read the book and agree with some aspects but disagree with others. It's not an unreasonable reaction because I think it's very easy to look at space exploration, which is an incredibly difficult, incredibly expensive, incredibly challenging and demanding thing to do, and say, are we really paying attention to that when we've got all these other problems on Earth? How could that possibly solve anything? And I was thinking about this the other day, and it struck me that I like to get the big perspective on things because I find that if you can step back and really examine things from the highest possible vantage point, you may get useful insights. And one insight I had for this is, let's suppose that my ideas of dispersal are real and that this does happen to life elsewhere in the universe as well as here. In that we obviously don't know whether that is true or not, but one can imagine. And that something akin to a better future emerges out of dispersal, or at least temporarily, temporary being thousands of years, perhaps tens of thousands of years for a species. Is that going to be an easy transition? And I think the answer is no, of course not. And the same is true for biological evolution. The first organism that found itself washed up on the shore of some distant island where it was exposed to different selective pressures, probably didn't have a great time of it. It was probably pretty miserable, right? And it took a while, it took many generations of natural selection evolution to sort of refine and bring out the traits in that species that enable it to live more comfortably in a given environment. And I think that could be part of why we see this pushback, we feel this pushback. I mean, all of us can feel it, to this idea of, why would space solve anything for us? It's because we're in that point of transition. We're at the beginnings, perhaps, of that point of transition. So it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be everything laid out on a plate. And that, I think, helps me at least appreciate the pushback. If you say that to people, it doesn't solve it. Right? You're like, oh yeah, come on, right? we still don't think this is the greatest idea. It's so difficult, and it's not going to immediately solve any problems. If anything, it's going to distract us from solving problems. But to circle back to what the quote you just gave of something I said, yeah, it is about creating chances. It's creating opportunities for us that haven't existed before. Maybe there'll be good opportunities, maybe they won't be, but unless you try, you'll never know. And so that is part of why it is something worth considering and worth pursuing.
And speaking of how difficult the initial dispersal may be, your chapter titled Terrans had a very strange effect on me. So it basically begins with a long list of things that can go wrong in space for a human being. You got radiation poisoning, eyeball deformation, bone loss, the list goes on. And reading page after page after page of that, I was starting to question my childhood dream of becoming an astronaut. Your book is all about our species burgeoning journey into space, but I was wondering when you wrote that section of the book, all about the horrors of actually traveling to space, did you ever wonder, I wonder if this is really meant for us?
It's a good question. And I'm a scientist, right? So I don't want to write a book that is extolling the virtues of space exploration and ignore the very real challenges and problems of it. So yeah, so writing it, I reminded myself of just how difficult this is, how tricky it is to take organisms like us that come out of a lineage of evolution on a single planet that may have diverse environments, but there are many things that are kind of constant across all of Earth's environments. Yeah, it's a balance, right? And again, I think it's that point of transition. You can't go into this blinkered. You can't say, yes, we're going to conquer the solar system like some horrible colonial power. We're going to do this and we're going to, obviously have 1 million people living on the surface of Mars and so on and so on. You can't do that without being realistic about the challenges. So, yeah, there were definitely moments where I thought, maybe this isn't going to happen. But then as you start to really address what those some of those problems are, whether it's radiation, whether it's the changes induced by low gravity, and you look a bit further than the next year or two, you begin to see ways around these problems and whether they're to do with engineering, the way you build structures and habitats in space, whether they're to do with manipulating biology, pharmacological solutions. I mean, we already deploy many pharmacological solutions for astronauts in the space station to help them stay healthy. We're learning. We're learning how to do this. And it's so far, there has not been a true showstopper. There are some really difficult problems, but we're incrementally finding solutions to those problems, I would argue.
That makes me feel a lot better. Now, Caleb, one of the first places that we might attempt to disperse to is Mars, at least as portrayed in popular media and science fiction stories going back many decades. And you write about three philosophical approaches to exploring Mars. So, number one, there is the approach where we send absolutely no one and we just don't even try to go to Mars as humans. The second approach is to send only scientists on, exploration, research-driven missions. And the third approach, of course, is to just do full-on colonization, send millions of people to Mars and terraform the world. But then you offer a fourth option, and you write, quote, by attempting to live on Mars in the best possible way, we can force ourselves to undertake the most focused effort in our history to truly understand the nature of sustainable planetary habitation. End quote. So, Caleb, could you expand upon this fourth option for us? What does that actually look like in practice?
Right. So the fourth option, in some ways is only subtly different than other approaches to Mars or other ideological stances on Mars, but I think it's really important. With Mars, there is this opportunity, not just to say, well, we'll go and poke at Mars, or we'll drop some humans down, or we'll even try to send 1 million people because it'll be a backup against existential risk back on the Earth. That's all fine, but it's sort of jumping the gun, I think. One thing we have learned how to do really, really well as a species is to quantify the world that we live on. We put up satellites to image the surface of the Earth again and again and again. Right? We have constellations of satellites doing that now. We monitor weather. We monitor the chemistry of the planet. We monitor our own movements on the planet. We've built navigational systems that encompass the planet and allow all of us to pinpoint ourselves, to within a few meters in a single moment. We have communications that channel information via satellites, of course, on the Earth, also through cables and transmissions, radio transmissions, and so on. We've learned how to build an extraordinary infrastructure that not only lets us talk to each other and do the things we want to do, but actually gathers a sort of endless stream of information about the functioning of our planet. And we use that. right? Remote sensing on the Earth in terms of satellites doing weather and land use measurements have injected hundreds of billions of dollars into world economies over the years, and it's something we don't often pay attention to. So I would argue that this fourth approach to Mars is to say, yeah, we can do a lot of these things. And, there's some decisions to be made about, you know, when we send humans, to what extent we send humans, or whether we hold off on that a bit or not. But the one thing that we perhaps can't afford not to do is to create this network of information about a planet from scratch, right? On Earth, it's been incremental. We've been inventing it and using it as we've gone along. Now, we could actually start out by, building this extraordinary informational infrastructure at Mars and understand this world in a way at the outset that we've never been able to do on the Earth. That supports exploration, that allows us to make hopefully better decisions about what we do with Mars than we've done on the Earth. And it lays the groundwork for safer, more efficient, less costly exploration of Mars. And for the same price, we're going to learn things about planetary function that are probably applicable to life back on Earth. And we can do this differently because Mars is a pristine world at the moment. By the time we put remote sensing satellites up around the Earth was already had a lot of humans and a lot of technology and a lot of, cities and infrastructure and coal burning and, atmospheric changes and so on. Mars is a place where it's pristine enough that we may learn something new about the nature of planetary climate, about the interaction between invasive species and a planetary environment, and what true sustainability really means. Mars is a place, and it's going to be a place like this for a very long time, where any human presence on Mars, the sustainment of that presence is going to require a level of attention to sort of environmental conditions and energy use and resource use that we really haven't dealt with here on Earth. Despite our best efforts to be greener, to be more sustainable, it's tricky. So that's a little bit long-winded, but essentially the idea of the fourth way on Mars is just to hold off for a second and actually build an informational infrastructure at Mars, which we know exactly how to do, right? And then use that as leverage to make whatever we do in the future that much easier and better and more useful.
Yeah, yeah. Sounds like you're inspired. I mean, obviously, you came up with the idea of the data ohm, so it's hard to say that you've been inspired by it. But it's like you're taking a leaf from that book, the Ascent of Information, and applying it to our dispersal, saying, let's gather the most amount of information that we can, create, this informational infrastructure, so that we can make wiser decisions when it comes to exploring another planetary body.
Absolutely, right? Because we've not tried that before.
Yeah. Now, on the other hand, we might say, let's just scrap planetary surfaces altogether. And this was one of the most insightful and surprising ideas that I found in your book, the suggestion that planetary surfaces might not be the ideal place to disperse to in space, which was surprising for me because, our science fiction stories are always full of, yeah, we're going to go and colonize this world in our solar system and then move on to exoplanets. We come from a planet. Obviously, the next place to try to go inhabit is another planet. But you're right that instead, we might find it way more fruitful to live on space stations of our own making, which of course reminded me of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Caleb, why might our future in space look more like living aboard Deep Space Nine than colonizing other worlds?
Yeah, so as I wrote the book, I was thinking about this and trying to make my own sort of decision about what sort of the evidence was pointing towards. And planets are problematic. Planets have deep gravity wells, so it's always going to be expensive to go up and down from the surface of a planet. And if you take a world like Mars, the surface gravity on Mars is always going to be a third that on the Earth, the gravitational acceleration. And we don't know what that will do to life from Earth over the long term. We really don't. I know science fiction has talked about humans living on Mars and, maybe you become taller and skinnier because of the low gravity. As far as I know, there's absolutely no basis for that extrapolation. I don't think we know what long-term exposure over generations to lower gravitational acceleration on the surface of Mars will do to us or to any other species. And there's issues of radiation and so on and so on and so on. And, some solutions people have posited for Mars are to do with the idea of terraforming, of modifying the Martian environment, making it more Earth-like, more hospitable. And, maybe over the long term, there are some things that could be done in that direction, but they're really over the very long term. So when you start to add it all up, the more you look at it, the more you realize planets are a pain in the neck. Right? Because there are aspects of planets that, unless they are already identical to the Earth, you can never change. Right? You're not going to change the gravitational acceleration on the surface of a planet. So the alternative is to say, well, we do know exactly the conditions that humans and other species from Earth thrive in. Those are the conditions on the surface of the Earth. We also know that we could, in principle, build artificial versions of those conditions out in space. We build habitats, we build space stations on steroids, we build, enormous structures that can be spun up to generate a form of artificial gravity. We can contain the atmosphere, we can control the composition of the elements, we can control the environmental conditions, we control the amount of light, we can shield against radiation, we can do all the things that we need to do to make a model version of the Earth. Wouldn't that be much easier, really and truly? Plus, we don't have to do it deep in a gravity well, right? We can do it in a structure that's much easier to get to and to leave again because of the lower gravitational acceleration. So I found myself, and I'm not obviously not the first person to think of this. Star Trek has thought of this, and many others have thought of this as well. That yeah, planets may be a bit of a red herring. Unless it's your planet of origin, or unless there's a planet that is almost identical to your planet of origin, why bother? Why do that? Why not do something different, more innovative? And that, of course, is also interesting for the idea of dispersal, because it opens up the terrain of a planetary system in a way that it doesn't get opened up if you're restricted to planets.
Right. You talk about the difference between the habitable zone, which in astrobiology is defined as the region around a star where an Earth-like planet can sustain oceans of liquid water, and the zone, what is it called? The most easily explorable zone. I may be messing up that term, but there's a huge difference between those two things.
Yeah, so in the book, and it's interesting, since the book, I've been working on this from a more technical standpoint. Yeah, in the book, I talk about the zone of easiest exploration.
Right.
And so that's really taking a look at our solar system and asking, a spacefaring species, where is it going to go? What are the pros and cons of being in certain parts of our solar system and being there in certain ways, whether it's in a sort of biosphere structure or whether it's on the surface of an object and so on. And actually, since writing the book, I got somewhat inspired to think about this more deeply. And I'm currently working on a research paper which talks about the idea of an interplanetary habitable zone,
Hmm.
which is asking, we think about habitability on planets, but what if you have life that has gone beyond its planetary point of origin? How will it occupy a planetary system? What are the factors involved in that? And where is it most likely to wind up in a planetary system? And so I'm actually looking at that using computer models that use so-called agent-based simulation, where you
Wow.
essentially model little entities that can replicate, can move around in the gravitational landscape of a planetary system, and you essentially just see what happens, and you build in the factors like the zone of easiest exploration, where's the least radiation but the most solar power, where are the easiest orbital transfers that require the least energy, and so on. That work is in progress, but I can tell you it's pointing to some kind of interesting things, especially when you put in the architecture not of our solar system, but of other planetary systems, of exoplanetary systems. It perhaps will give us some clues as to where life could end up in those systems.
Wow, that's so cool. I can't wait to read that paper.
I
And
will
I bet
share it with you.
excellent. Yeah, I bet this interplanetary habitable zone really widens the scope of where and how to look for signs of life elsewhere in the cosmos. And I think that's really important to do in our state of relative ignorance about life in the universe right now, is to generate these really intriguing hypotheses that then have testable predictions that one day with a telescope we could go out and try to prove or disprove. So that's something I really admire about you, Caleb, the audacity to come up with these creative ideas that really shape the way we go about our search in astrobiology.
Little bit of craziness is useful.
So, if we are to inhabit and disperse into our solar system on board spacecraft and space stations or spun up asteroids, we'd want some kind of artificial gravity. And Star Trek doesn't really explain at all how artificial gravity happens. But the real world suggestion is, again, as you said, to basically spin up a construct, and then you would be pulled to the ground through centrifugal force. In your book, you reveal that this isn't exactly a perfect solution. And I've never, before reading your book, stopped to really think about how the simple act of, say, pouring water or going for a jog would be difficult on a spinning spacecraft. Caleb, could you talk a little bit about the physics involved here?
Yeah, it is really fascinating when you think about the details. So the idea here is, as you say, if you spin a structure and you inhabit that structure, let's say it's like a bicycle tire with spokes and you're living on the rim of that tire, if you spin it up, you will experience centrifugal force pulling you down towards the inner rim of that rotating structure. And that mimics, in some ways, is equivalent to a gravitational acceleration. Gravitational acceleration on the surface of a planet is acting on us constantly, pulling us down. To replicate that, you need some other situation where there's a constant acceleration being applied to any objects in the system. And one way to do that is to move in a circle. So anything that moves in a circle is undergoing constant acceleration, and that's the centrifugal force. Now, what's interesting about that is that in any finite size structure, like a rotating bicycle wheel, the amount of that force varies with your distance from the central axis. So imagine I'm standing in a rotating space station, like something in, 2001, the rotating space station in 2001. So my feet are on the floor, which is the inner rim of this rotating structure. And in fact, my head points towards the axis of the rotating structure. What that means is that, in fact, although it's a small difference, my feet are moving in a larger circle around that central axis than my head is. Okay, because my head is a little bit closer to that central axis. And of course, if I climbed a ladder up towards the central axis, I would change my circular motion. I'm then going to be moving in a smaller circle and I'm going to experience a different centrifugal force. What this means, though, is, and this is something that we don't really experience on the Earth because the height difference between your feet and your head and a gravitational field on the surface of a planet like the Earth is so minuscule compared to the gradient in the gravitational field, you don't really notice it. But if you're in a spinning centrifuge, you can notice it. And so what happens when you bend down to pick something up? Well, you're actually moving your head and the top of your body through different levels of circular motion. And so you will actually experience something akin to Coriolis effect. You experience a force, and it's also to do with the change in angular momentum as you move your head from one radius in this rotating system to another radius in this rotating system. So if you bend down to pick something up, you're actually going to feel a force pushing you forward or pulling you back, which is going to be very disconcerting. But it depends on the size of the rotating structure that you're in and how fast it's rotating. So, there are other things that will happen. You mentioned, pouring water, right? So I have a jug of water in my hand and I pour it down towards a glass on a table. Well, that means the water has to transition between different levels of circular motion. And it too will experience a Coriolis force. And so it's not going to fall in a straight line stream to my glass. In fact, it's going to be this wonky stream on the way down. You're going to have to learn how to deal with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And, if you want to go for a jog, again, 2001, famous scene, astronaut is jogging around the interior of this rotating structure in the spacecraft that's heading out towards the outer solar system. If you run in the direction of rotation, you'll feel heavier. If you run against the direction of rotation, you'll feel lighter. If you could run fast enough to actually match the rotation in the other direction, you'll start to float off
Hmm.
in your structure. So it's a very bizarre set of physical circumstances. You can mitigate it to some degree by having that rotating structure be really large so that the period of rotation is low. That helps with our inner ear and our human sense of balance. But it also sort of mitigates some of these other problems because if you're on a much larger scale, then actually the differential between your head and your feet is less. So you can mitigate some of these problems by just going big. But smaller structures, it's problematic. And it's anything under about 100 meters across that's rotating. You're really going to have to adapt as a human to some very disconcerting phenomena.
Wow. Okay, those engineers really need to get working on the Star Trek artificial gravity
That's right.
because
That would be a lot easier if you could just switch it on and off.
yeah, exactly. Caleb, in the final chapter of The Giant Leap, you run through a bunch of current and future technologies that might help us with dispersal. Many of these have been featured on Star Trek as technologies that species have developed on their way to warp drive. They include ion propulsion, space elevators, and solar sailing. I was wondering if you have a favorite mechanism for achieving dispersal, Caleb.
A favorite. Well, let's see. You know, things like space elevators and solar sails are wonderful in terms of their sort of audacity. One is building a structure from the surface of the planet all the way into space, or lowering something from space all the way to the surface of the planet. The other, solar sails, is about using the actual pressure of photons of radiation to move around the solar system as if you're an ancient mariner, using the currents and flows of wind and ocean on the Earth. They're lovely, but I actually think the mechanism or the propulsion technique that has the potential to grow in terms of its ability and to actually get us around the solar system is ion propulsion. And obviously, it's already in use. We have many spacecraft, satellites around the Earth. Many satellites around the Earth have actually used sort of small ion thrusters for a very long time to maintain their station. And we now have interplanetary missions and have had for a while that use ion thrusters or ion propulsion. And the beauty of ion propulsion is that unlike chemical rocketry, where you're just madly exploding stuff in a chemical reaction and then coercing it to take some of that thermal energy and channel it into one direction of momentum, is very inefficient. Ion propulsion, on the other hand, involves taking each single particle of your fuel and accelerating it and using it as propulsion in a single direction. So from the get-go, you're coercing it and accelerating it. Each particle in an ion drive, whether it's a particle of xenon gas or something, you are devoting all your energy to a very directed impulse that you're giving to your rocket. So it's vastly more efficient. The challenge is having enough electrical power to drive that. And I think what's so interesting at the moment is I'm seeing more and more discussion about not only so-called solar electric propulsion, which is kind of what we use at the moment. So you have solar panels providing electricity that provides the power to accelerate your propellant to high speeds and use in your ion drive or ion propulsion unit. But we're now beginning to talk about nuclear electric ion propulsion. So a nuclear reactor, a fission reactor that can generate megawatts of power, plug that into an ion drive, and now you have something that is a much more serious contender for moving around the solar system relatively quickly and efficiently, and without the same demands on refueling that you have with chemical rockets. And we see this coming up as an issue for example, getting to the moon again, getting to Mars again, is having the chemical fuel to get back again is a
Hmm.
problem. And you either take it all with multiple launches of even things like the SpaceX Starliner spacecraft, multiple launches to get enough fuel on board to get to somewhere like Mars and get back again. Nuclear electric propulsion, your propellant, there's much less of it. And so it's easy to take along more than enough propellant than you need. So yeah, so that's the long-winded answer to, my current favorite propulsion technique is to take this idea of ion propulsion, which has been around for a very long time. People were talking about it in the early 1900s. Robert Goddard, one of the pioneers in rocketry, built a rudimentary ion thruster in his lab just to try the idea out. So it's been around for a long time. I think it could come into its own in the future.
Fantastic. Wow. Let's make it so.
Yes, make it so.
Finally, Caleb, let's talk about AI in space exploration. This is a topic that's near and dear to both our hearts. On Earth, we're increasingly shuffling off tasks to AI. We don't necessarily need to, but we do so mostly out of convenience rather than necessity. But you're right that space is wholly different. You say, quote, space exploration makes the capacity for autonomy absolutely unequivocally essential, while also keeping humans with our problem-solving abilities and intuitions firmly in the loop. So, as a final thought experiment or paint me a picture of the future of space exploration, Caleb, how do you see this interplay, this coevolution between AI and human exploration in space? Because I could see a certain scenario where we just send our robots full of, fancy AI to go exploring for us, and we just sit here on Earth and let the data stream back to us. Or is it going to be more of a co-equal partnership?
Well, I think both those things are going to be true. There'll be circumstances where you need full autonomy and you just send things out, machines out with some form of AI or machine learning system on board that will make decisions. We're already doing that to some extent with our exploration. Rovers on Mars make a certain amount of autonomous decisions and so on and so on. And, then yes, there will be situations where humans are out there and we need support. We need experts on hand in the form of AI, and we need to remain engaged in what's going on. I was actually thinking about this, though, and to give a sort of a fun vision of one possible direction that this could take, which is perhaps not so different than Star Trek and thinking about Lieutenant Commander Data and so on.
Hmm.
We're nowhere near having data amongst us, I think. But imagine a scenario where our species is more dispersed across the solar system, and there is still a need for human expertise, but there's a limit to how many humans can have certain types of expertise and so on, just like today, right? Not all of us are expert neurosurgeons, not all of us are expert car mechanics, right? We partition expertise off. So one of the challenges with that, though, is on Earth, I can pick up the phone. Suppose my plumbing goes wrong. I pick up the phone and I am in real-time communication with an expert plumber who will say, okay, before I get there, you've got to switch this off and you've got to do this. Great. If I'm on Mars, then on average, it's, maybe 20, 30-minute round trip travel time for me to say, my plumbing on Mars has gone wrong, but the world expert in Martian plumbing happens to be back on Earth. So I can pick up the phone or the radio, but in those passing 20, 30 minutes, everything is going to go to hell, right? I need to fix it now. What can I do? So it occurs to me that one thing that we could probably already begin to do is construct types of AI, particularly LLMs, large language models, that are tuned to be the same as certain experts. And I actually started thinking about this because I was starting to think about, wouldn't it be lovely to talk to Charles Darwin?
Mm.
And in a peculiar way, you could do that. You could take all of his writings and writings about Darwin, and you could take a modern large language model like ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude or whatever. And we already know that you can tell those models to restrict themselves to the information contained in certain documents and certain databases. And they're probabilistic in terms of their output, but you could in principle make your own sort of Charles Darwin that you could have a conversation with. For space exploration, perhaps what you really need to be able to do is to build AI experts that mimic real individuals or groups of individuals in one place of the solar system in order to share it with other places in the solar system, so that you will have your AI plumber on Mars that is like talking to the expert back on the Earth because it has been trained and fine-tuned on the data describing that expert's knowledge and their sort of actions in certain circumstances. So there could be this very peculiar future where we all have versions of ourselves scattered across the solar system that, yeah, our physical cells may be in one place, but there may be versions of us elsewhere. And that could make sense also for social ties. Half your family emigrate to Mars. But you want to retain certain connections, but it's hard to do that because of light travel time. You don't have causal connection in the same way. But maybe it helps everyone to have an AI version of each other on hand. What would my dad think in this circumstance? Well, I know I need to really ask him, but let me start by asking, Dad Alpha, who I happen to have on my smartphone on Mars. What should I do in this circumstance? And I'll get some hints from them. So I do wonder whether beyond the sort of mechanics of exploration and the need for autonomy and so on, there are fundamental shifts in how we embody ourselves in the world that might make a lot of sense in a dispersed species across a planetary system.
That's fascinating. It really reminds me of the emergency medical hologram in Star Trek Voyager. Instead of an AI plumber, well, here all of a sudden, I've got this medical ailment. Let me just call up the AI doctor to heal me. And your notion of having AI family members to turn to when your real physical family members are very far away reminds me of the holodeck and all of the shenanigans that go down there in Star Trek.
You see, Star Trek foresaw all of this, right?
Uh, well, I wonder when I'll get my AI Caleb Scharf, because I always enjoy conversing with you and bouncing my crazy ideas off of you. So, but I know that you have a limited amount of time, and I don't always want to be bugging you. So, just send me an AI version of yourself, Caleb.
I promise to tell you whether it's real me or not real me.
Okay, sounds good. Well, this is a pretty good place to end it. Thank you so much again for writing a wonderful book. I really enjoyed reading it. And thank you for spending this time on Strange New Worlds to tell our entire audience all about some of the incredible ideas in the book. We didn't have a chance to cover all of them. So everybody out there, make sure you go and pick up a copy of The Giant Leap. And Caleb, I just want to give you this last opportunity to just share any upcoming news of yours, plug any projects that you have upcoming that you'd like our audience to know about, or just share where people can find you on social media.
On social media, I crop up on X or formerly Twitter, Caleb underscore Scharf. You also pop up on Blue Sky and LinkedIn these days. I don't post as much as I perhaps would like to with thoughts, but I do put stuff out there so you can catch me there and reach out. If you want to reach out, I try to respond, but I don't always manage to do so. And yeah, in terms of other developments, well, I think, for the world at large, they should keep an eye on what you, Mike, are doing and what we're doing together in science using AI, looking for biosignatures in the world. That's going to be really, really exciting over the next few years, and I think NASA has some more tricks up its sleeve, despite things that are going on at the moment. So keep your eyes on the stars, and also down here on Earth at what we're doing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Caleb.
My pleasure.
So, as you can probably tell, I love talking to Caleb. And that means that wasn't actually the end of the interview. We kept on going because there was one more burning question I just had to sneak in. A question about the Fermi paradox, which asks, in a universe that seems primed to produce so many interplanetary civilizations, where are all the aliens? I've got one bonus question that I thought of that I should have included, but I feel kind of bad asking it because I hate it when people ask it of me because my answer to it changes on a day-to-day basis. But the question is like, what's your favorite current answer to the Fermi paradox? And given this idea of dispersal, I was just wondering, like, if we really think this is an inevitable transition that an inhabited planet undergoes, yeah, where is everybody? What's going on?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I too I sort of think about it quite a lot. So I guess I would answer it in a couple of different ways. So the original notion of the Fermi paradox was not about why haven't we noticed distant alien species
Hmm.
sort of out there in the universe. It was more about why haven't they been here already?
Right.
Why have we not noticed them coming through our solar system? This was Enrico Fermi's sort of insight to that. And I think the idea of dispersal is not incompatible with our current lack of evidence of life coming through the solar system within human memory. A couple of years back, I did some work with some other scientists, and we modeled the dynamics of interstellar species around our galaxy. And we looked at, how often an individual star might experience a visitation. It might experience a wave of exploration or even settlement passing through it. And it turns out that, there are circumstances where you can have a galaxy with a lot of interstellar faring species setting out these waves of exploration periodically over long time scales, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, and so on, millions of years even. And there are circumstances where the density of those species is such that yes, everything has been visited, but maybe not everything right now is being visited.
Okay.
And that there are configurations of that kind of hypothetical, inter or galactic population of explorers where our solar system, it's quite feasible that the last time other species came through our solar system was more than 10 million years ago.
Hmm.
And more than 10 million years ago, evidence of that might have vanished altogether. We tend to think that, we think about fossils, dinosaur fossils, and so on, but those are exquisitely rare,
Hmm.
and we're missing 99.9% of all the species that ever have existed on the Earth. We don't know about them because they're gone. There's no evidence, or we haven't found that evidence yet for them. And the same is true for civilizations. And so when I did this work with colleagues a few years ago, some of them had also done some work on what was they then called the Silurian hypotheses.
Oh yeah, this was Adam Frank's stuff. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. And when you look at the preservation of our current human civilization, it turns out that, in a few million years, there really wouldn't be very much left. If it all ended today, if it all switched off today,
Hmm.
there would be some strange isotopic anomalies. There might be some weird molecules related to plastics, but by and large, evidence of this civilization would be gone in a few million years, and certainly by 10 million years. So that's interesting in this context of the Fermi paradox, because it may be that you could have a galaxy with quite a lot of spacefaring interstellar species, but the periods between them sweeping across and even inhabiting a system for a while may be such that we're just in a window where that hasn't happened for a while.
And the lack of evidence for aliens, having inhabited Earth is also consistent with the idea of dispersal, where spacefaring civilizations are not interested in colonizing other worlds. They just want to, travel around in their spacecraft. One might swing through Earth every once in a while and say, oh, what an interesting world. That doesn't look like a good place for me, but, maybe I'll observe it for a while and then move on.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, the idea of dispersal, as I describe in the book, gets to thinking about, what are the endpoints of that for, say, our species. And, so if you do the sort of back of the envelope calculations, right, you can show that there's enough material in the solar system, particularly in asteroids, to construct thousands of Earth-sized biospheres containing literally trillions of humans, if you so wanted, if you could do that. And that seems sort of outrageous, and it is outrageous because it's not going to happen anytime soon. So there may be the situation where before a species goes interstellar, it's going to establish itself as interplanetary. And getting from a few billion to, tens of trillions of individuals may take a while.
Mhm.
And then you also wonder, having done that in one place, and perhaps you've learned that planets are not that interesting. If you really want to boost your numbers, if you want to create as much real estate and many places to inhabit as possible, then you build structures or you utilize asteroids and so on. Yeah, the impetus for going elsewhere, I don't know, it may be less than we imagine. It may take, several billion years to fill out a planetary system to the point of bursting,
Hmm.
right? At which point, we're only 13.7 billion years into the history of the universe, right? So there may not be that many places where that sort of filled to bursting has happened, that
Hmm.
growth has happened. Maybe it's still on the upward part of the growth curve in most places. Yeah, so the Fermi paradox, I mean, I know, we simply don't have enough data to rule out pretty much anything at this point, I would say.
And that's why we're here. That's why Caleb and I are astrobiologists, why we're explorers. The answers are out there in the cosmos, waiting for our next giant leap to reach them. If you're enjoying Strange New Worlds, please rate and review us, or just tell a friend about the show. Once again, Caleb's book, The Giant Leap, is available wherever books are sold. Go grab it! You won't be disappointed. Next time on Strange New Worlds, we'll be joined by another incredibly important figure in my personal scientific journey. Dr. Bob Hazen, my colleague and postdoctoral mentor at Carnegie Science's Earth and Planets Laboratory, will beam aboard to discuss a new book that he and I co-authored called Time's Second Arrow. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you out there.
If you run in the direction of rotation of your spinning habitat, you will actually begin to feel lighter. If you run against the direction of rotation, well, actually, no, sorry, it's the other way around. See, it's so confusing.